I was raised on radio, and I've got blood in my veins, but I've also got radio waves pulsing through my body, and so I've got a love for that. And I'm here partially to speak about the so-called fairness doctrine. And he wants me closer. Sorry, I can't. No more solidarity. I'm sorry, guys. I'm going to talk a little bit about the threats to broadcaster freedom, but the one thing that excites me about radio is, since I was a kid, I always had I love this realization that God invented radio waves. And I believe he did it for a purpose. And I'm a Cubs fan. No offense to any Reds fans or other teams, but I'm a Cubs fan. And I love being on the road at night in my car, and I can't watch the Cubs games. I can catch them on the radio. And that's a great thing, but that's just a byproduct. That's a side effect of why God invented radio waves. You know, he invented the entire universe and the whole physical structure of everything of the world. He could have invented things just the way they are and left out radio waves and left out TV waves, and we would be none the wiser. We would have no idea. Why did he stick them in? I believe to proclaim freedom. I believe that's why God invented radio waves. To share the good news of the gospel, the freedom that our nation was founded upon. And I believe it was a dark day for the forces of darkness when Guglielmo Marconi and others discovered and learned how to harness radio waves, which God had invented. So, I look at the history of our country, of our nation, and the history of my family in Christian broadcasting, and I see a series of crises. And I look at you here standing in the rain, and I think this is just a tiny taste of what it was like at Valley Forge. Can you imagine what our great-great-great-great-great-grandfathers went through? Weeks of numbing coldness, men losing toes, little food, eating wood, eating shoe leather, in the coldest winter in history, in the middle of the woods. Why? For freedom, for us, for today, so we can benefit from that. That was a crisis a long time ago in our nation's history, at the very dawn of our nation's history. A crisis a long time ago in my family. My grandfather was a radio engineer for HCJB World Radio out of Quito, Ecuador, one of the three large, I see some of you are familiar with it, one of the three large shortwave radio ministries that has spread the good news of the gospel and freedom around the globe for generations. Well, it barely got off the ground. When it started, they had this vision for high wattage transmitters high up in the Andes Mountains at the roof of the world, one of the roofs of the world, and so they could spread out around the globe more effectively, and they couldn't get it done. I'm not an engineer, I'm just a radio guy, a DJ, but they couldn't get, it was arcing. There was something about the high atmosphere, and they thought, you know what, no one's ever tried this before, it's not going to work. We're not going to be able to do it. We're going to have to close up shop and head home, and that's the end of the dream. And my grandpa and my grandma, and my dad, who was just a toddler, and my uncle, they went down to the coast of Ecuador, and for 2 weeks they prayed and they fasted and they asked God, how can we get through this crisis? And he gave my grandpa a vision for what is called the cubicle quad antenna. And it worked. And they were able to transmit a high voltage, and the rest is history. And for generations they've been blessing the world. That came from God. The same place that radio waves come from, the same place that freedom comes from. When we won the Revolutionary War at Yorktown, it wasn't over. It's easy to think, and I know most of you are students of history, but for many people it's easy to think, oh, we won the Revolutionary War and it's been America ever since. Well, 40 years later, the British came back in the War of 1812 and they burnt the White House to the ground. I mean, it was perilous times. Things were bleak, just like they are now, just like they seem now. Although it doesn't seem bleak being with you guys, but this is a festive spirit, but things were bleak. But they pushed through and they prevailed. And that was more recently in American history. And when my grandfather got back home, he was one of the founding members of the National Religious Broadcasters Board of Directors. He was the engineer represented on the board. And they faced a challenge. Not every challenge is from overseas or from foreign enemies. Some challenges, as we know all too painfully right now, are internal. And I don't care what label is on it. If it's opposed to freedom, then it's messed up and then it's messed in the head. And freedom is what matters. And it was the original threat to Christian broadcasting was actually some of the mainline old churches. They didn't want the upstart evangelical preachers to be on the radio waves, and they tried to suppress their freedom. What Obama's trying to do now, other Christian churches tried to do. Well, that's why they formed the National Religious Broadcasters, and they were able to overcome that threat ever since. When I was a little boy, I was too young to remember, but the Carter administration. Who remembers the Carter administration? Yeah. I mean, I've read about it, right? I've talked to my parents about it and lots of other people. Those were bleak, depressing times. And I mean, incredibly long fuel lines, sky-high inflation. We lost the first war in American history, 58,000 American casualties. A president was forced out of the White House. And on and on. Iranian hostages, we seemed powerless. The world was mocking us. And we overcame it because freedom prevails, because freedom overcomes. And, you know, I want to share with you just a couple of lines from my favorite book in the world. We are hard-pressed on every side, but we are not crushed. We are perplexed, but we are not in despair. We are persecuted, but we are not abandoned. We are struck down, but we are not destroyed. I need to hurry up and wrap up, but I just want to say that we will always have crisis. There will always be threats to freedom, and there's many going on right now. Speaking quickly from my perspective as a Christian broadcaster, the so-called fairness doctrine. And this is just basically a naked, raw power grab. This is just outright suppression of the political debate in America. That's all it is. And it's really the unfairness doctrine. It's bizarre. It's completely bizarre. It's like something from Hugo Chavez's Venezuela or from Putin's Russia, so-called democracies, and they just start dictating free speech over the airwaves. Exactly. Go away. Crawl back to Soviet Russia where you came from. Well, the good news is, right here in Indiana is the man at the forefront politically of defending and against the so-called fairness doctrine, and that's a great American statesman, Congressman Mike Pence from Indiana. He's the author of the Broadcaster Freedom Act, and there are more than enough votes in the House of Representatives and in the Senate to put the Broadcaster Freedom Act through. There are almost 100 congressmen alone who voted for a one-year moratorium on the fairness doctrine at least once, but won't sign a discharge petition to force an up or down floor on the vote on the floor of the House. And as Mike Pence himself likes to say, when freedom gets an up or down vote on the floor of the People's House, freedom always wins. So what do we do? What do we do in the midst of this crisis? Well, you guys are like a living testimony, an example, a role model of what we should do. I mean, there is so much hope here. It's funny, I prepared these comments about things are bleak, crisis. They don't seem bleak right now when you're standing out in the rain with fellow patriots. They don't seem bleak at all. So we're gonna press ahead. What's our family gonna do as a Christian broadcasting family? We're gonna do the same thing that you're doing here and that our forefathers did, that my grandfather did. We're gonna press ahead because freedom wins. We're gonna press ahead because the same one who invented radio waves invented freedom. And I know how the story ends. Freedom wins. I don't know how many more chapters remain to be written, but we're gonna continue to write these chapters. And with God's grace, we're gonna press out. My vision is that there will be Christian radio across the entire state of Indiana that is encouraging, but that also stands up for truth and for freedom unapologetically, for life and for family and for freedom. And by God's grace, we're able to do that in about 24 counties in northern Indiana. We're very close to moving into the west central part of the state, into 15 or 16 more counties. Very close. And I don't know, maybe someday Indianapolis. I know that Indianapolis has not had a consistent, widespread radio presence. And if that's God's will, maybe there's someone here who wants to be part of that. Get a hold of me. Google WFRN and contact me. But I'm thrilled to be here. There's nothing but hope. And at the darkest hour, we look back at the crises before us and we see that freedom wins. So God bless you guys.